The first time Claire Harrington woke up in her own bed and couldn't remember how she got there, she told herself it was stress, until she smelled the faint, chemical sweetness on her breath and realized someone had been helping her sleep. Claire lived in a tidy coastal town where mornings began with salt air and the soft grind of delivery trucks at the bakery down the street. She liked her routines. Black coffee. A short run. Emails answered before most people finished brushing their teeth. She'd built her life brick by brick, no shortcuts, no dramatic risks, so when Evan Cole appeared, he felt like something she hadn't budgeted for, a storm with perfect weather in its eye. They met at a charity gala where Claire had donated more out of habit than hope. Evan wasn't the loudest man in the room. He was the one who made people feel heard. A warm smile. A voice that carried sympathy like it was part of his job. He spoke with the confidence of someone who'd survived hardship without turning bitter, at least, that's what he suggested. He told her just enough. A difficult childhood. A career that never quite recovered after a health scare. A string of bad breaks that sounded tragic but not suspicious, because Evan never asked for pity outright. He simply wore vulnerability like a neatly pressed shirt. Within weeks, he was everywhere in her life in small, reasonable ways. He remembered the name of her dog. He dropped off soup when she mentioned a long day. He sent a message at exactly the right time, when her house felt too quiet and her phone too silent. Evan didn't push. He positioned. Claire's friends said he seemed attentive. Thoughtful. Finally, one of them told her over brunch, someone who takes care of you. And Claire wanted to believe that. She'd spent years being the capable one, the practical one, the woman who didn't need rescuing. Evan made her feel like she deserved softness. Then came the crises. The first was a sudden call from Evan late at night, his voice strained, breath uneven. He said he'd been having chest pains, that his doctor had warned him about stress, that he didn't want to worry her but he didn't know who else to call. When Claire arrived, his apartment was dim, smelling faintly of menthol and candle wax. He sat on the couch, pale, one hand pressed to his sternum, the other trembling around a glass of water. "I hate being like this," he whispered. "I used to be strong." Claire sat beside him and felt her chest tighten with protective instinct. Evan leaned into her shoulder as though her presence alone could steady his heartbeat. By morning, he seemed better, almost miraculously. He laughed it off, blamed anxiety, promised he'd see a specialist. He thanked her like she'd saved his life. A week later, he arrived at her home with paperwork tucked neatly into a folder. "It's boring," he said, smiling, "but my doctor told me to be responsible." He spoke about planning, about how frightening it was to realize how quickly everything could change. He didn't mention money at first. He mentioned security. Peace of mind. Not being a burden. Claire didn't notice how smoothly he guided the conversation toward policies, beneficiaries, and signatures, how he made it feel like her agreement was a gesture of love rather than a financial decision. After that, Claire began losing time. It started with exhaustion that didn't match her schedule. She would sit down after dinner and blink, and suddenly it was 2 a.m., the television still murmuring, her phone face down on the rug. She found bruises on her shin and couldn't recall bumping into anything. Once, she discovered her front door unlocked in the morning, the chain undone, as if someone had left quietly without wanting to wake her. Evan's concern was immediate and theatrical. He offered herbal teas, massages, warm baths. He insisted she was overworking. "You're running on fumes," he told her, smoothing her hair back with gentle fingers. "Let me take care of you." Then the accidents began to orbit her life like vultures that looked, from a distance, like harmless birds. A small kitchen fire that Evan miraculously noticed before it spread. A strange smell in the garage, gasoline, maybe, followed by Evan insisting she stop driving her car until it's checked. A minor scrape in a parking lot that became a dramatic story about how dangerous the roads had gotten lately, how easily something terrible could happen to someone as good as her. Each time, Evan was the hero. Each time, Claire felt more dependent. And each time, something subtle shifted, her confidence thinning, her circle shrinking, her world slowly narrowing to the space Evan occupied. One evening, while Evan washed dishes with almost aggressive cheer, Claire opened her laptop to pay bills. A notification popped up, an email about a policy update she didn't remember requesting. Her cursor hovered. The words looked ordinary enough. But the beneficiary name made her throat go dry. Evan Cole. Claire stared at the screen until the letters blurred, listening to the water running in the sink, listening to Evan hum like everything was normal. Behind her, he turned off the faucet. "Hey," he said softly, stepping closer. "You look tired." And for the first time since meeting him, Claire didn't feel cared for. She felt watched. Claire didn't confront Evan that night. She closed the laptop slowly, as if sudden movement might alert him, and forced a smile that felt stiff on her face. Evan noticed anyway. He always noticed. "Long day?" he asked, leaning against the counter. His sleeves were rolled up, hands damp, posture relaxed. A man with nothing to hide. "Just tired," Claire said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've been pushing yourself again. I worry about you." His concern landed softly, but it carried weight. It always did. Later, when Evan slept beside her, breathing evenly, Claire lay awake staring at the ceiling fan as it traced slow circles through the dark. The house felt different now, less like shelter, more like a stage set where every object had been placed deliberately. She replayed the past months, searching for moments she'd brushed aside. The paperwork. The way he always volunteered to handle things when she felt overwhelmed. How often she'd felt foggy after meals he prepared. The next morning, Claire called in sick for the first time in years. When Evan left the house, she moved with careful urgency. She checked drawers, then folders, then a locked box she'd never bothered to open before. Inside were copies of documents she didn't recognize, insurance summaries, handwritten notes, timelines. Her name appeared again and again, neat and deliberate, like a project title. Her stomach tightened. Claire began paying attention in a way she never had before. She noticed how Evan insisted on driving at night. How he discouraged her from meeting friends, framing it as concern for her energy. How he reacted sharply, just for a moment, when she questioned him. The charm never slipped entirely, but now she saw the seams. She made a quiet appointment with her doctor and described the exhaustion, the memory gaps. Blood tests were ordered. When the results came back, the doctor frowned. There were substances present that shouldn't have been there, sedative levels inconsistent with anything prescribed. Claire left the clinic shaking. When she confronted Evan days later, she chose her words carefully. She told him the doctor thought stress might be causing blackouts. She watched his face as she spoke. For a fraction of a second, relief flickered there, quickly replaced by concern. "See," he said gently. "I told you. You've been burning yourself out." That night, Claire pretended to sleep. She heard him move. Felt the mattress dip. Smelled something faint and bitter. Her heart pounded as she held her breath, every instinct screaming danger. She didn't open her eyes until she was sure he was gone. The next morning, her car wouldn't start. Evan insisted it was unsafe to fix it immediately. He offered to drive her everywhere. Claire agreed, outwardly grateful, inwardly calculating. She began documenting everything, dates, times, comments, small details that once felt insignificant. She hid copies online, shared fragments with a friend she trusted, just in case. Then came the crash. They were driving along a rural stretch of road just after midnight, rain misting the windshield. Evan was behind the wheel, one hand loose on the steering wheel, the other resting on her knee. He talked about the future, trips they'd take, a quieter life, how lucky he was to have found her. The car suddenly veered. Metal screamed. Glass exploded. The world spun and slammed and went dark. Claire woke upside down, the seatbelt biting into her ribs, smoke curling through the cabin. Pain flared in her leg, sharp and blinding. Evan was already out of the car, shouting for help, his voice clear, strong, untouched by panic. She smelled fuel. Summoning everything she had left, Claire unbuckled and dragged herself free just as flames licked the edge of the wreck. She collapsed onto wet gravel, coughing, watching fire consume what was left behind. Later, at the hospital, Evan wept at her bedside. He told police it was an accident. Slick roads. Bad luck. He held her hand while she nodded weakly, still dazed, still unsure who would believe her if she spoke. But Claire survived. And survival changed everything. While she recovered, Evan grew restless. Money had gone missing from her accounts, small amounts at first, then more. A storage unit she didn't remember renting turned out to be full of items from her house. When she questioned him, his warmth cooled. "You're not thinking clearly," he snapped once, then quickly apologized. "I just want to protect you." Claire no longer doubted herself. She contacted authorities quietly. Then louder. And when she began speaking to other women, her fear hardened into certainty. Because she wasn't the first. And she wasn't meant to be the last. The first woman Claire found lived 3 time zones away and spoke in a voice that still carried caution, as if danger might be listening. Her name was Laura Bennett. They connected through a quiet online forum Claire had joined under a false name, one meant for people navigating financial abuse. Claire hadn't expected anything to come of it. She certainly hadn't expected to read a post that felt like someone had been standing in her kitchen, watching her life unfold. Laura wrote about a man who seemed too good to be true. About sudden illnesses. About exhaustion she couldn't explain. About waking up with bruises and no memory of how they appeared. About small fires. About money draining away in ways that made no sense. And about a crash. Claire's hands trembled as she typed a reply. When they spoke, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Evan had used the same phrases. The same reassurances. Even the same concern-filled lectures about stress and not trusting your own body. Laura survived her crash too, but only because a delivery truck had been close enough to pull her free before the fire spread. "He told everyone I was confused," Laura said quietly. "Said I was embarrassed about my mistakes, so I invented stories." Laura had reported him. Nothing had come of it. Then there was Megan Foster, who lived in another country entirely. She had never been in a crash, but she'd lost nearly everything financially. Evan had convinced her to sign documents while she was recovering from what she'd been told was a viral illness. By the time she realized what had happened, her savings were gone and Evan had vanished. 3 women. Same man. Same pattern. Claire brought everything to investigators: records, messages, medical reports, timelines she'd kept obsessively during her recovery. This time, she wasn't dismissed. There was too much. Too many coincidences stacked too neatly on top of one another. That's when a name surfaced that stopped Claire cold. Naomi Price. Naomi had died years earlier in what authorities had ruled a tragic accident. A late-night car fire on an isolated road. Evan had been the only witness. He escaped with minor injuries. Naomi hadn't made it out. At the time, there was no reason to question his story. He'd been cooperative. Devastated. A grieving partner who spoke lovingly of a woman he planned to marry. But when investigators reopened the file, details began to glow under scrutiny. Naomi had taken out a large policy months before her death. Evan had been the beneficiary. Friends recalled her being unusually tired in the weeks leading up to the crash. One mentioned Naomi complaining that her food tasted strange. The car fire report was thin. Too thin. As authorities across borders compared notes, a picture formed, one of patience, planning, and escalation. Evan didn't rush. He studied. He rehearsed. He refined his approach each time, learning from mistakes, pushing further when he believed no one was watching. When police finally came for him, Evan seemed almost relieved. He greeted them calmly, asked if he could put on a jacket, apologized for the inconvenience. The charm was still there, but it was fraying at the edges. In interviews, he denied everything. He framed himself as unlucky. As misunderstood. As the real victim of unstable women who resented him after relationships ended. But the evidence no longer relied on belief. It relied on patterns. And patterns don't lie. Interrogations stretched for days, then weeks. Evan Cole sat across from detectives with impeccable posture, hands folded, eyes steady. He never raised his voice. Never appeared rattled. He spoke like a man accustomed to being believed. He told them about love. About sacrifice. About how every woman he'd been with had been fragile, in her own way. He said he was drawn to people who needed him. That he had a caretaker's heart. When confronted with documents, he smiled sadly and said paperwork was confusing for some people, especially under stress. But investigators no longer listened to his words alone. They listened to chemistry reports. Financial trails. Digital footprints Evan hadn't known he was leaving behind. Experts confirmed the presence of sedative substances in Claire's system after the crash, levels consistent with repeated exposure, not accidental ingestion. Fire investigators re-examined Naomi Price's vehicle and concluded the blaze hadn't spread naturally. The point of origin suggested preparation. Intent. Emails Evan believed were long deleted were recovered from servers overseas. In them, he researched policy structures, payout timelines, and legal thresholds. He asked questions no grieving partner would ask. Witnesses came forward, neighbors who recalled seeing Evan late at night, carrying containers to and from garages. A mechanic who remembered Evan insisting a car be returned quickly, repairs unfinished. A friend of Naomi's who remembered how Evan discouraged her from seeing family shortly before her death. The calm narrative Evan had constructed over decades began to fracture. Claire testified first. She spoke slowly, clearly, her voice steady despite the weight of the room. She described the charm, the concern, the way Evan made her doubt herself without ever raising his voice. She described waking up disoriented, smelling bitterness on her tongue. She described the crash, the sound of metal, the heat, the certainty that she was meant to stay inside that car. Evan didn't look at her. Laura testified next. Then Megan. Different countries. Different years. The same story told 3 times with chilling consistency. Each woman described the same pattern, trust built carefully, independence gently eroded, danger disguised as bad luck. The courtroom listened. Evan's defense argued coincidence. Bad relationships. Misunderstandings. They said grief and trauma distorted memory. They pointed out that Evan had survived too. That he'd never directly harmed anyone, at least, not in a way anyone had seen. Then prosecutors introduced Naomi Price. Photos of Naomi filled the screens. Her smile. Her life. Her plans. The fire expert explained how the blaze would have moved through the car in minutes. The medical examiner explained how Naomi would have been incapacitated before the flames began. There was no room left for accidents. For the first time, Evan reacted. His jaw tightened. His foot tapped once against the floor. The mask slipped, not dramatically, but enough. When Evan finally took the stand, his story shifted subtly. He admitted to mistakes. Poor judgment. Even selfishness. But never intent. Never harm. I loved them, he said. I would never hurt someone I loved. The prosecutor let the words hang in the air before responding. Love, she said quietly, doesn't leave this pattern. The jury didn't take long. They found Evan Cole guilty of killing one partner, attempting to kill another, and defrauding a third. When the sentence was read, life without release, Evan nodded as if he'd expected nothing else. As officers led him away, he glanced once toward the gallery. Not at the women. At the exit. Already calculating a world without him in it. The sentence ended Evan Cole's freedom, but it did not immediately quiet the damage he left behind. For Claire, the weeks after the verdict felt unreal, as if the world had tilted and never fully settled back into place. The courtroom applause, brief and restrained, echoed strangely in her ears. Justice, she learned, did not arrive with relief. It arrived with exhaustion. She returned home to a house that still carried Evan's fingerprints, figuratively and otherwise. She replaced locks. Changed routines. Slept with lights on. Even with his name locked behind concrete and steel, her body remembered the danger before her mind could reason it away. Laura moved cities. Megan changed careers. None of them escaped untouched. Financial investigators continued untangling Evan's web long after the trial ended. They discovered more policies, more drafts of plans that had never reached completion. There were notes about timelines, about improvements to strategy. Investigators believed Naomi had not been the first target, only the first death proven beyond doubt. The idea haunted everyone involved. Detective Mark Ellison, who had reopened Naomi's case, admitted later that the most unsettling part was how ordinary Evan had seemed. No outbursts. No threats. Just patience. A man who understood that trust was the most effective tool available. Public reaction was swift and sharp. Headlines called Evan a master manipulator, a quiet predator hiding behind charm. People asked how so many warning signs had gone unnoticed. How systems designed to protect had failed again and again. The answers were uncomfortable. Because Evan didn't look dangerous. Because he sounded reasonable. Because the women were told, again and again, that stress explained everything. Naomi Price's family attended a private memorial years after her death, finally given language for what they had always felt. They spoke of her laughter, her discipline, her careful optimism. They spoke of the way she'd grown distant near the end, apologizing for being tired, promising to visit soon. Claire stood at the back, listening. She did not speak. She didn't need to. What mattered was that Naomi's story was finally told honestly. From prison, Evan never confessed. He filed appeals that went nowhere. He wrote letters portraying himself as misunderstood, framed by coincidence and bitterness. None of it changed the outcome. Time moved on. Claire eventually returned to running in the mornings. Not to clear her mind, but to remind herself that her body was her own again. She spoke at closed seminars for investigators, explaining how subtle manipulation works, how danger doesn't always arrive loudly. Believe patterns, she told them. Not charm. At night, when the world was quiet, Claire sometimes thought about the moment she'd smelled that bitterness and known something was wrong. That single instant of clarity had saved her life. Others hadn't been given that chance. And that truth stayed with her, heavy, permanent, but grounding. Because survival, she learned, carries responsibility. And silence helps no one. Years passed, and Evan Cole became a name spoken only in classrooms, court summaries, and quiet warnings shared between women who trusted each other enough to talk. His world narrowed to schedules, locked doors, and the slow erosion of relevance, the one thing he had always needed most. Inside prison walls, Evan aged quickly. The charm that once disarmed strangers had no currency there. He was no longer interesting. No longer central. And for a man who built his life on control and attention, that absence was its own sentence. Outside, the women rebuilt. Claire never described herself as healed. She preferred aware. She learned the difference between kindness and strategy, between concern and control. She trusted again, carefully, deliberately, but she trusted herself first. That, she said, was the victory Evan never anticipated. Investigators updated training protocols based on the case. Insurance reviews changed. Cross-border databases began flagging patterns that once slipped through gaps. The system hadn't been perfect, but it had learned. Naomi Price's name was added to official records not as a tragic accident, but as a life deliberately taken through planning and deception. Her family finally had truth, even if it arrived late. Even if it hurt. Every case like Evan's leaves behind a question no verdict can fully answer. How many moments of doubt were ignored before it was too late? The answer is never simple. Because danger doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it comforts. Sometimes it smiles and tells you everything will be fine. Claire understood that now. On quiet mornings, when the sun rose over the same coastal streets she once ran while unaware, she breathed deeply and kept moving forward. She didn't look back for Evan. He no longer mattered. What mattered was this. Patterns were seen. Voices were heard. And one story, once dismissed as coincidence, had finally been told the way it deserved. Not as an accident. But as a warning.